So it's about the top of the hour, so we're going to get started. My name is Mark Whitby. I'm with DATAMARK. And for this webinar, what we're going to be talking about for this session is boundaries between counties and states. So I have a couple of my friends here. My panelists are going to be on here, and we're going to do some introductions. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So Annie, if you don't mind starting.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon. I had to check my time and figure out where we were at. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Annie Cahill. It's good to see everyone again. If you are joining me again for this webinar, I really appreciate it. I hope you're enjoying the conference this week. I'm a technical consultant with DATAMARK. I run all of our strategic planning services as well as the boundary facilitation workshops. So thank you so much again for joining, and we hope to have some really good discussion.
All right, Anderson.
Hey, good afternoon, where I'm coming from. My name is Anderson Brooms. I am the GIS program manager for the state of Alabama 911 board office.
Awesome. Thank you very much for being here. Andrew Hamilton.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is Andrew Hamilton, the communications chief for the Escambia County, Florida, Pensacola, and we've been working on DATAMARK for quite some time now on a large project, and glad to be here.
Great. Thanks for being here, Andrew. And Shannon.
Hi, I'm Shannon Pugh. I'm the GIS division manager for Escambia County, Florida. In case you wanted to know, Escambia County is at the far western tip of Florida. We're bordered on two sides by Alabama.
Excellent. And again, my name is Mark Whitby. I'm a project manager with DATAMARK, and Annie and I have been doing these boundary workshops for about 1.5 years together. So when we came up with this topic, I'm like, I know who I want on here. And like Andrew said, DATAMARK's been working not just with Escambia County, Florida, but also what we call Region 1, which is 12 counties. So we've been doing a lot of boundary facilitation, and I got to work with Anderson a lot because, again, Escambia County, Florida borders the state of Alabama, and ironically, Escambia County, Alabama. So it was a lot of fun doing that workshop saying Escambia, and both of them would answer. So I had to clarify a lot. So we're going to have some discussion and talk about boundaries, not just county to county, but state to state, and why it's important. So Annie, what is boundary facilitation? What do we do at DATAMARK to call it boundary facilitation, and what you run?
So boundary facilitation involves orchestrated discussions between different counties, different PSAPs to determine the correct location for your PSAP boundaries and your emergency service boundaries. And the reason this is so important is because in a next generation 911 environment, your boundaries are actually going to be routing the call, which is very different than how things work in an existing 911 environment where GIS is really used toward the end of the call as more of like a reference. In a next generation 911 environment, all of that GIS data is being moved to the front of the call. And in a way, you as GIS people become geospatial first responders. If you've been with me before, we have talked about this before, the important role if you're a GIS professional, how important it's going to be for your GIS data to handle that responsibility. And then from the public safety perspective, you're gonna be introduced to a lot more nerdy things with GIS. So there's a lot going on there with boundary facilitation, but it's very important to get these discussions going because you want to have congruency between your boundaries, right? You don't want any intentional gaps or overlaps. You want to make sure that no matter where a call comes in, that there is coverage and then it gets routed to the correct PSAP the first time. So before we move on, Mark, I did want to ask everyone in the chat, can you guys tell me where you are and in terms of like your state or your county, and what is your locality doing to talk about these boundaries? I'd like to know if you're having these talks with your PSAP people, if you're in a GIS position, are you talking to your PSAP folks? And if you're PSAP and you're on the call, are you talking to your GIS folks? And what is your locality doing to really facilitate this process, or has there been any direction at all? That would be really cool to know.
Yeah, that'd be really helpful. So, we collect the data, right? So we collect not just your boundary, but we also look at your address points in your roads, because as you guys know, a lot of roads will run from one PSAP to the next or one county to the next, right? And there could be address points right on the boundary. And if there's a gap, like Annie said, and there's an address that falls in that gap, what happens when you call 911? It doesn't know where to go. And since we focus on the PSAP boundary for most of these workshops, it's really all about public safety call routing, right? We're moving away from that traditional MSAG. Hey, we have a road range and we have a high and a low and a community and an ESN, and that's how it routes. Or in the alley, it's connected to that ESN. So we're kind of moving away from that, right? And what I really like about Annie and I doing these is Annie's a GIS person, or as Annie says, a GIS nerd, and I'm allowed to say that. And I spent most of my career in public safety. And then toward the end of my career, I got involved with MSAG Alley, and then I moved into GIS. So when we would have a new address assigned in our county, I would make sure it worked in the CAD system, but I had to add it to GIS. So I had to add the address point or the road, or and then make sure it was in the alley and the MSAG. So that way it could be routed properly. So I got to do a little bit of both worlds in the end of my career. But again, as a dispatcher, knowing that, time matters. So when we moved to GIS, we want to make sure that that call's routed to the right PSAP the first time. And we're not transferring calls back and forth, not just county to county or PSAP to PSAP, but in this case, we're talking with Florida and Alabama, right? Two different states on how they do things. So what kind of answers are we getting, Annie?
We had one person say that they haven't received any direction from their locality or their state regarding how to handle preparing their boundaries for NG 911. Someone from Oregon says that they report address changes to their PSAP / MSAG, which is good. Okay, so addresses are part of it. Paul says we have our boundary submitted to Rapid SOS. Okay, so some people are chiming in with some good answers.
Excellent.
The entire
Awesome.
state of Washington plus the city of Idaho. I work with all counties and PSAPs. Okay, all right, Dan. Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, if you're in the Zoom platform, if you've never used Zoom before, there is a chat feature. If you're wondering kind of like what I'm doing, there's a chat feature there, and you can feel free to engage with us in that chat.
Definitely. And there are some NENA standards that are out there, right? So we have the NENA data model, right? The GIS data model from NENA from 2020. Now it is being revised. So version 2 hopefully is coming out in the summer months. But there are certain boundaries that are required. So a PSAP boundary is required. Emergency service boundaries. So they talk about the law, fire, and EMS being separate boundaries, as well as a provisioning boundary. So for those who don't know what a provisioning boundary is, that is basically a boundary where you're responsible for adjusting that data, right? So if it's an address point or a road, you maintain that information. And then there's also a link to this document. And the best part about NENA is you don't have to be a NENA member to go to their website to download these standards. So they're open for everyone. So if you're not familiar with them, take a look, okay? So this is a boundary that we did. So Anderson was involved, as well as Andrew and Shannon, where we worked on the boundary between Escambia County, Alabama, and Escambia County, Florida. So in this case, you can see the 3 boxes. So we have 3 different examples we're going to show you. So example 1, notice, what is that line right down the middle, Annie? Is that like the state line? Is that what that is? I don't think so, is it?
That is actually, let me move my chat box. That's a gap. That's a
gap,
consistent gap. Yep.
Right. So we talk about those boundaries matching up like a jigsaw puzzle, right? They're all interconnected, right? So this would be bad, because what if your house was in that gap and you called 911? It might not go to Florida. It might not go to Alabama. It might go to a default, and then they would have to transfer it once they determined it. So example 2, it's a little bit closer, but if you notice, it looks like there's some properties there. It looks like there's some structures. So again, if that structure's in the gap, another issue, right? And if you notice, the gap gets kind of big, and as you move further to the left side of the screen, the gap gets a little bit smaller. but we want to close in these gaps, right? And then this one, it's kind of like a flowing river, right? So you have, it's close, and then, oh, it connects, and then it kind of breaks off again. So again, gaps and overlaps, that's what these conversations are all about, to decide who's going to adjust their boundary, right? Now, a lot of times when Annie and I are on these phone calls, a lot of people get worried about, oh, we can't move the Alabama state line, or we can't move the Florida state line, or we can't move our legal county line. We're not moving any legal boundaries. We're adjusting it for PSAP call routing. Okay. So we're not messing with taxation or voter registration or, hey, who picks up the garbage or anything like that. It's more for that call to be routed to the right PSAP. Okay. And then after boundary facilitation, this is what it should look like. It should look all connected, all clean, right? So that's the goal of these discussions. And with DATAMARK and Annie and I, we help facilitate these conversations. We document some notes, we talk about best practices, and we kind of help you work through this. But on these workshops, we include different people. So we include GIS and public safety. So Anderson, let me ask you, as a GIS person, right, for the state of Alabama, why does GIS need to be involved in these workshops?
Hey, Mark. Well, thanks. One of the things that we are doing in the state of Alabama is we have implemented sort of a beta geospatial call routing in our largest and most populous county, Jefferson County, which holds our largest and most populous city, Birmingham. In the November-December call routing reporting, consistently through the life cycle of our ESNet provider tracking call routing or call transfer data, Jefferson to Birmingham City and Birmingham to Jefferson County were our top 2 number of transfers, no matter what, consistently over every single call reporting period. In the November-December call reporting period, when we instituted our geospatial call routing with our ESNet provider, not only were those dramatically reduced by 40%, they fell off our top 10 for the first time. Both transfers fell off our top 10 for the first time. Now, why is boundary facilitation important to us? Within that geospatial call routing functionality, we have not yet cleaned up the borders with those boundaries within. We have 13 municipal ECDs inside Jefferson County ECD. And as you said earlier, within our geospatial call routing functionality, if there is a gap, an overlap, we default route, and then we have to introduce a transfer into the system. So GIS directly drives our call routing functionality, and boundary facilitation is essential to not only further reduce transfers but to also make sure we don't default route to one of our default route districts.
Awesome. Well, and that's great that Alabama's doing that, right, as a pilot to work through this and then continue through the rest of the state. So Shannon, let me ask you, why is it important for you to be on these boundary workshops that Annie and I were doing between your county and Alabama? Why was it important for you to be there?
I think it's important for the GIS to be involved because we do the day-to-day mapping. We deal with geospatial issues every day. Plus, we issue the addresses. In our county, we issue the addresses. Plus, we edit the street center lines. All these things are impacted by the boundary, so-called legal boundary, but also the PSAP boundary.
Exactly. Good point, because a lot of GIS departments do addressing as well, right? And maintain all those different layers, not just the ones for Next Gen 911 that we're talking about, but for other purposes within your county, right? So that's really important. So Andrew, I'm going to toss it over to you. Why is public safety so important to be on these workshops with the GIS people who can, manipulate the data?
Well, I think from my perspective, I'm not an expert in GIS, right? So I handle 911 and radio and that sort of thing. And so, I know this side of the house, but not so much that side. And so collaborating together, it allows us to see both sides and understand what the needs are. And, at the end of the day, we want to send the correct and closest unit to each call and, avoid unnecessary transfers on the telephone. So just by being a part of the effort, we can better understand what the needs are from the GIS side and from the public safety side, and just work together to make this all, the best it can be.
Exactly. Great answer. Because on the public safety side, you know, again, you guys know where your fire houses are, right? Your fire stations and what areas they cover, where GIS may not know that because they don't deal with these phone calls and these fire stations and law enforcement as much as the public safety folks do. So that's a big piece too, because as a public safety person, I might be able to tell Annie, my GIS person, hey, can you make me a boundary? And she goes, yeah, where do you want it? I tell her what I want and she can draw that boundary or draw that line, right? But I can't do it as a public safety person, right? I don't have that expertise, Andrew, like you said. That's not in your wheelhouse, right? So you work with Shannon to have them do that. So having both GIS and public safety on the call makes it really a collaborative effort, I guess I could say. But are there any other stakeholders we could invite? What do you guys think?
We found it beneficial to invite, you know, some of our partner agencies. And I know they're the Shannon group that engaged, you know, like the city of Pensacola. And I think the property appraisers at one point were involved. So there was a lot of other people involved because, you know, at the end of the day, we hope we can collect this data once and then use it for multiple purposes and multiple agencies.
Exactly. And sometimes we might need to bring a fire chief in or a sheriff in, right? Because again, they know their districts best. So again, maybe we need to bring some 911 operators in, not just the 911 coordinators or the person who runs the PSAP. They're not taking all the calls that other 911 operators are. So again, this can really grow and be beneficial if you have a lot of municipalities. You know, we like to have the municipalities involved because again, they may have a secondary PSAP boundary or they have a PSAP boundary that we need to take into consideration as we go through this whole process. So it's really important to bring the right people to the table, right? So we can make those decisions and get the data corrected and get it up and running, right? So what are the challenges when it comes to doing a boundary facilitation and collecting data and running topology and all this stuff? So Shannon, from the county level, what do you think the challenges could be?
Well, the challenges could be these, in our county, between Escambia County, Alabama and Escambia County, Florida, we actually have some houses that are in Florida, but you actually have to drive up into Alabama to get to them. So your challenge is, do you want to make this part of the PSAP boundary for Alabama since they would respond better to it? Or do you, you know, the legal boundary being that they're actually in Florida? So that's some of the stuff you have to grapple with.
Yeah, that's a great example because, and it happens in a lot of counties, just the way the access is makes it a challenge. So again, we're not saying, hey, Escambia County, Florida, yeah, this is my address and they pay taxes to us, so we have to go. But again, what if it takes 10 minutes for Escambia, Florida to get there and Escambia, Alabama can be there in 2 minutes, right? We think of that life safety thing, kind of important. And we always talk about like MOUs. Is there agreements between the county and maybe a PSAP or a county to a county or even a state to state on mutual aid, right? How this can best be handled. When it comes to region, we're working in Florida Region 1, and the goal is for Region 2 to connect after they do their GIS. So we're going to be not just connecting 12 counties boundaries for one regional layer. Now we're going to add maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 more counties. And then the next region connects. And pretty soon you have like what Anderson's working on, a statewide data set of boundaries, right? That's not an easy undertaking, is it? So Anderson, what are the challenges for you working with a big state project and then connecting to Florida or even Georgia, because you guys border Georgia as well?
So internally, the challenge in front of me is that we have 85 emergency communication districts with 127 PSAPs, which results in 637 individual boundaries that need to be facilitated. An example of an interesting dynamic of what I believe what Shannon was referring to in our neighbors to the east in Georgia, the Chattahoochee River separates us, and there's several man-made lakes along the Chattahoochee River. And there's actually a community on the western side of the lake that is by definition in the state of Georgia, but it takes the responding SO's office 45 minutes to get around the lake because you can only get across on the northern portion of the southern portion of the lake. So while dispatch is patched through what I cannot remember the county in Georgia's name for handling the 911 call, the responding agency is a corresponding SO's office in Alabama. So your PSAP boundary reflects that neighborhood or that community being in Georgia, but your law enforcement boundary reflects that being in Alabama.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great example. And water boundaries are something we come up with a lot when Annie and I do some of these workshops. And again, what's a best practice? If there's nothing in the waterway, but it's just a waterway, well, who has access to boats, right? If a boat needs to go out there, Alabama doesn't have a boat, but Georgia does, right? So it would make sense for Georgia to use the boat, right? Or the closest fire station, or maybe law enforcement has a boat or a jet ski or something. So again, these are really good discussions that we have on these phone calls. And it's
Mark,
really interesting to talk through it. Go ahead, Anderson.
Just going back to your other stakeholders example previously, we have the Mobile Bay, which is our largest body of water, which the Alabama River empties into the Mobile Bay, which empties into the Gulf of Mexico. And two of our larger districts right now are trying to sort out where to draw an arbitrary boundary in the water, because while the county boundary says it's halfway from shorelines on the bay, you have to bring in local responding agencies, volunteer fire departments, all the way up to Alabama Law Enforcement Agency and the Coast Guard. So,
right. Yeah. How far out do you put that boundary in the water, right?
Right.
Because I worked a lot of my career in Florida. So I lived in Pinellas County. I worked in Hillsborough County for a while as well. Pinellas County is surrounded by water on three sides. So, we divided up in the middle, but, if we go off the coast, off the beach, we may handle the first mile, mile and a half, 2 miles, and then the Coast Guard gets involved. Well, what if it's further out? What if it's 50, 60 miles out? What other marine, vessels can get that far out, right? Besides the Coast Guard. So really good topics of conversation. So things to think about, right? So let's look at it this way. So what are the benefits? We'll start with Anderson. From the state level, what are the benefits of doing these boundary facilitations and working all these challenges and details out?
Well, like I alluded to earlier, we have it's about the last count, 637 individual boundaries between responding agencies, and to facilitate the state board office's goal of geospatial call routing in the entire state, and to prevent, in the case of an overlap, a default route, and in the case of a gap where it can't determine who is the responding dispatch agency, it will revert to tabular routing, which we all know can fail given the number of transfers that we see between our districts. So the goal at the state level is to have a topologically coincidental provisioning, PSAP, law enforcement, fire, and medical response for emergency call routing, location validation, and dispatch.
And that's a big undertaking, right? It's a
is.
lot of work. But again, as we move toward next gen, let's start working on these things now. So that way, when we select a core service provider and we're ready to move, our GIS data is already ready to hand off. So Shannon, let me ask you, from the county level, what's the benefits in GIS about these workshops?
Well, from actual GIS perspective, the benefit to the boundaries being the same is that we have something to work on with our streets. We can make sure we clip our streets at the exact same spot, and that we maintain connectivity from county to county. We don't have any kind of routing applications going on right now, but I know we will in the future. That's going to go from county to county.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Especially in the panhandle of Florida, Interstate 10 runs through every county, right?
Yes.
So
Yes,
again,
it
being
does.
able to snap that to that boundary is really important, right? Especially
Right.
if you're using AVL or any other type of routing systems, right?
Exactly.
So, yep, excellent. All right, Andrew, from the PSAP level, what are the benefits?
Well, I think it's some that have been kind of mentioned already, but, top of my head, we can have improved decision-making ahead of time for pre-planning, response, maybe staging areas, that sort of thing. Obviously, better response times because now we're not having to try to figure this out on the fly. You mentioned the water. Our county is bordered on the east and west by rivers, and then the Gulf of Mexico on the south. So we do have a lot of water rescues, and a lot of times there's no clear cut location, and so cleaning this up and making this making these decisions on the front end help us find these people in a quicker manner.
Yeah, because that's a frustrating thing for a dispatcher when you can't get a location. How do you send a responder, right? And I've sat in that seat where I've had problems finding out where somebody was. So again, moving to GIS, using the I3 version of what they're recommending, it's going to help, and these citizens are going to reap the benefits, right? We're going to be able to find them much more accurately, much more quickly, and we won't be transferring them back and forth until somebody can get to help them. And that can save lives, and that's huge, right? Really, really important. All right. So, Annie, is there any questions that we've had pop up as we've been talking about some of this stuff?
I had answered one regarding the very, very common conundrum that a lot of people face, which is balancing the requirements of all of these different systems, right? Your CAD system, your 911 system, your next gen core service provider, your asset management, your permitting system, and balancing those needs with what you actually have to include in the data and what's the best way to manage that data. And the answer is always, it's a very individualized approach that you need to take. There are different ways to go about doing this. We've had a lot of folks who just kind of have one giant data set because they don't want to manage 3 or 4 different address points data sets. I get it. I'm a lazy GIS person. I don't want to do that. Also, we have people who use an ETL process to extract that data and use it for these different applications. And then there are folks who do manage individual data sets. So without really digging into your workflows and assessing things, I would say the answer just depends. But if that's something that you're really struggling with from a GIS data management perspective, I would say definitely try to seek out some workflow assessment, either through strategic planning or just getting together with your different stakeholders and trying to figure out how everything works and get it on paper. And that can be a big help, just understanding, because you may not realize that, your data may be used in a system that you're unaware of. It just might be really old data. So, that's one thing I could recommend for everyone.
Excellent. And you make a really good point, because a lot of times we have so many different data sets, not just boundary layers, but address points and road center lines. And, we have these silo data, and 911's always been protected, right? We've always used our own data. But if we have really good data, why can't we share it with others, right? Now, maybe we need to add a field because they want to put the speed limit in there so they can use it for call routing. Okay, we add a field, right? But again, instead of trying to manage multiple data sets, like you said, then one of them gets out of date and, we could have issues later down the road. So excellent. Any other questions that popped up?
Yeah, so Haley said, would common working boundaries be a sufficient way to maintain such layers required? So Haley, can you expand on that? What you mean by common working boundaries? Because I had asked a question about, does everybody maintain the required boundaries for NG 911? So I'll go ahead and ask the question in case you guys weren't watching the chat. Do you guys maintain your required boundaries? Do you have a provisioning boundary, which is kind of like a geofence for your GIS data management area? Do you have a PSAP boundary? Do you have individual service boundaries for fire, law and EMS. Do you guys maintain those? Go ahead and drop that in the chat for me.
Yeah, and a lot of places, like for example, ESNs. I mean, we've had ESNs for a long time, since like the early 80s, because we used it in our MSAG. And some GIS people, much smarter than me, would take those ESN numbers and create like an ESN boundary, right? That's not the same as an emergency service boundary. It's
Right.
defined a little bit different, right? Some counties may have one PSAP for the entire county. So the county I worked at, we had our primary PSAP answered all the 911 calls in the county. So we had one PSAP boundary, but we had multiple secondary PSAPs where we would transfer a call to for law enforcement. So again, you could have separate boundaries for those. Secondary PSAP boundaries are not required by NENA, but you may have systems that need it, right? In your 911 system, right? Or in your CAD system is a good example. So as you're working through these different data sets and boundaries, you want to make sure that you don't break anything that you already have connected, right? Hey, we got these great new boundaries. Let's put them in CAD, and CAD shuts down. That's not good, right? So sometimes we have to work with our CAD provider or our CPE or our phone system provider if we're going to put those layers in there as well to help the dispatchers.
Yeah, and it looks like Haley kind of expanded. She said a common working boundary that would be used to supersede legal city, county, and state boundaries. So the thing about this that's so important when we're talking about designing and developing call routing boundaries is that they are not supposed to be tied exclusively to your legislative boundaries. Okay, so your municipality, your county boundary, you can start with those, but as Mark was discussing earlier, and Shannon, I think, had mentioned, sometimes it's faster for a specific PSAP to get to a location outside of their PSAP than where the location is actually physically located. So we have to kind of look outside of the situation a little bit and think of some creative ways to draw these boundaries that are not tied. We always want to tie things to our legislative boundaries, and I get that. As a GIS person, I 100% get that. But the good thing is that we don't have to do that because these are for call routing. So we want to make sure that the call goes to the right location the first time. We want to minimize transfers. That's really important because every time you transfer, that just adds time onto a call, right? So I would say you can start with your legal boundaries, but your call routing boundaries are definitely not tied to those boundaries whatsoever. The question that you always need to ask of your data is who gets the call first. That's very, very important.
Agreed. And again,
I think building on that discussion, I think it's really important. When I started in my role here at the board office, I had that mentality. There had to be one boundary to rule them all, right? And it had to be the county boundary, and the county boundary was the final say on what all other boundaries inside were. And while that's definitely not the case, at least in the state of Alabama, I've come to the viewpoint of each boundary within the NENA I3 standard does an independent and separate job that what geospatially can be, and in a lot of cases will be, completely different geospatially within said county district. That the PSAP boundary is responsible for the routing of the call. The provisioning boundary is responsible for setting the boundaries of which you are the data maintenance authority, and it's where you edge match your road center lines and you delineate address is in county A or district B, right? And then separately and completely independent would be fire law and medical response, to be assisted more on the CAD side than it would be the call routing and delivery side. So for those on the call that have not yet ventured down this path of considering the required layers and what they do, it took me a very long time to get my head around the idea that they do independent functionalities and that they don't have to be topologically coincidental with each other. A lot of times they are, and in a lot of cases they're not. So
yep, great example. Because again, when we're moving from our traditional 911 and enhanced 911 to this new next gen 911, and we're using GIS data instead of an MSAG or ALI, we start, 911 starts going, what do you mean we're not using that? We got to use this map stuff. How accurate is that? It's all new, kind of freaks some people out. But you have to wrap your head around it and see the bigger picture, right? How it's all interconnected. So that's huge. So any other ones, Annie? Any other questions?
Just some discussion going back and forth. So Brian had mentioned that they have ESZs, right? So a lot of you already have ESZs, or you may call it an ESN layer or response boundary. You have many different names for these different types of public safety boundaries. And it's perfectly fine to start with those. That's totally fine. We would call those like legacy boundaries. But in a next generation 911 environment, you do need to have them broken out into individual service types. And you don't have to stop with fire law and EMS. If you're in a coastal community and it makes sense for you to maintain a Coast Guard boundary, then that's something that you should definitely consider and have those discussions. I think Shannon had dropped a comment about how their boundary facilitations were very friendly with a lot of agreement. Is that always the case, or are there disagreements sometimes? Yes, there are. There are definitely disagreements from our perspective. And I think it all stems from kind of just current thinking and not thinking, being confused about how things operate in a next generation environment. It's really hard because it's kind of a paradigm shift how we do things in NG91 versus how we do things today, where the GIS data is literally making the decision before the call ever comes into the PSAP. That's very hard for people who have been making these decisions for a long time and they're used to things being a certain way. So anyway, I would say that, yes, there are different types of discussions that can occur, but I think as long as we keep having the NG91 discussion and why things need to be the way that they are, I think it takes the edge off from my experience.
Yeah. And education, right? Looking at some of these NENA standards, attending this, third annual DATAMARK virtual conference, we're having discussions and we're educating people. So like it would help Anderson, the more educated he got, the more it made sense to him, right? So again, the more you know, it's always good. So you can always reach out, ask questions, right? The NENA standards change, they come out with newer versions because we've learned over time, lessons learned, right? Hey, maybe this was a good first step, but now we need to modify that, right? To be able to use it. So like your PSAP boundary may not change a lot. Your county boundary may never change, right? Or your state boundary, right? But can your fire law and EMS boundaries change? Sure. What if you put a new fire station in? Or you redistrict your law enforcement zones or your beats or those kind of things, or you add a new substation and that's where people are going to be housed and dispatched from there. So some things will change. A lot of cities are annexing into the unincorporated areas. So, some of your boundaries may change for, hey, whose PSAP is this in internally, smaller PSAPs, if it's not a county-wide PSAP boundary.
Mark,
Very
in my
cool.
experience going down with public safety response, the most disagreeable bunch of folks are volunteer fire department chiefs.
Well, and again, as a volunteer fire person, right? Hey, if you're trying to take this area away from me, I lose money because I've lost the amount of calls, right?
Yep.
And again, fire is different than law enforcement. And, people love paramedics, people love firefighters, right? They come, they help them. Law enforcement, not so much because they have the power to arrest them, right? Take away their freedom kind of thing. So some of those boundaries for law enforcement officers, like a city officer may not be able to go into a county and make an arrest, right? Because of legal. Okay, I get that. So our boundary has to reflect that, right? Awesome. And any other questions in there, Annie? I see like 44 messages. That's awesome. I'm glad you guys were interacting with us. I appreciate that.
John said, I understand the service boundary layers aren't tied to legislative boundaries and can be adjusted as needed to fit PSAP needs. However, what about the administrative units layers, state, county, municipality that are strongly recommended in the GIS data model? These are by definition representations of legislative. Yes, so they're strongly recommended, but they're not used for call routing. So they are definitely recommended. They're great to have. I always recommend to people throughout strategic planning that yes, focus on getting your required layers built to where they need to be first, and then focus on the strongly recommended and the recommended layers. But those are not used for call routing. Only ones that are used for call routing are the PSAP and then the service boundaries. The provisioning boundary, again, is kind of like that geofence that tells the spatial interface, hey, here's the area for which I am responsible. The data that's within that boundary, I'm responsible for that. So that's a great question.
Right. So that provisioning boundary, like Annie said, if there was something wrong with GIS data, it would know to contact Anderson, right, with the state, or a county in the state of Alabama, or Shannon in Escambia County, Florida, saying, hey, something's wrong with this address point. He would have to go in and make the adjustment.
And we're fortunate in the state of Alabama that we have a GIS executive council that is directed out of our GIO's office, and they are undertaking a separate but coincidental project to go about defining those legal boundaries, both within the state, in its neighbors, and individual county boundaries, which again, we are in 911 not in the business of doing.
Yeah, that's great. Again, Alabama's done some really forward-thinking things, right? Because again, a lot of ECDs, a lot of PSAPs, a lot of boundaries, and the state is helping out, and that's amazing. So very cool. All right, Annie, anything else?
Just another comment that they're used to populate required attributes in the road center line and address points, which are used in routing. The boundaries are used for geospatial call routing. The road center lines and the address points are for the call validation, just to kind of clarify that. But it won't affect the routing. So you don't, again, those are not used to make decisions in the call. They can be used to populate the attributes for sure.
Right.
And Annie, if you are adhering to the strictest of I3 standards, which as a GIS nerd myself, you absolutely should be, where there is a dissimilar geographic area between 911 response for, say, Montgomery County and our neighbors to the south in Pike County, that where they are overlapped a bit because they represent two independent districts and responses and legal boundaries and whatnot. You would actually break that road center line at the overlap, the overlap, and assign the section that's in Montgomery County 911 to Montgomery County, and the section that's in Pike County to Pike County, but the road center line would actually remain within the purview of Montgomery County. That sounds like it's probably clear as mud, but you can always break a road center line, and by I3 standards should break all road center lines at all polygon breaks.
Yep, exactly. And that's been another tough one when we talk to people about that, because people are like, wait a minute, we have to break it across all. Yes, you do, because remember that it's not about looking at everything individually. I mean, you can have topologically accurate boundaries, et cetera. Your road center lines could be perfect, but when we're talking about NG91 GIS data, we want to make sure that we're looking at everything as a whole. There are a lot of different facets. It's not just looking at the road center lines or just looking at the address points. Okay, if you have perfect address points, but your ranges are not where they need to be, then the data set is not where it should be. Okay, so that's the other thing, is kind of taking a broad look at everything and making sure that it's all reflecting the same information. So that does involve what Anderson was talking about, is breaking those road center lines at different boundaries and making sure that everything is reflecting the same info.
Yeah, we have a very common recurring theme on our presentations to districts when we get to the point where we're running DATAMARK's validation engine and get the anomaly reporting back and explain that they're not, the road center lines are not broken at polygon changes, and it sort of sinks in and they go, that's a lot of work. And I have to be the bad guy that says, yep, it sure is.
It is. It's a lot of work, but once you get it done, we reap the benefits of that, right? So
yes, we do, but not to put a cloud over things, you have to continually make sure that your data is is as close to 100% as possible, right? So when you get it up to 911 standards, you get all your required layers, you get all your attributes situated, you know, your geometry is where it needs to be. You still have to work on it. You can't just walk away from it.
Yeah,
It's
that
an
maintenance
iterative process. It's
Right.
an iterative process. And if you're not currently validating, while we have a few minutes, please drop in the chat. What are you guys doing to validate your data for NG911? Are you doing anything currently? Do you have any QC measures in place? How confident are you? I mean, we understand that you may have all the layers, but what about the quality, right? So can you just drop in the chat, what are you guys doing to validate your data, if anything? Because that's a really important thing that we need to talk about. And we did talk about it a little bit yesterday in my presentation. And we may have more coming up that discuss that, but it would be really interesting to see.
Yeah.
So,
Okay,
so for us at the state, you know, shameless plug for DATAMARK, we are utilizing the DATAMARK validation engine on all 85 of our districts and have had a lot of success running validations. And you know, the inside joke here at the board office is iterative is my favorite word. And it truly is an iterative process where you upload the data, you run the validations, you get the reporting metrics back, and you go to work and you take the validation metric reporting and you load it into whatever your GIS editing system of preference is, and you put the work in.
So
Yep.
Anderson, while we have a couple minutes left, can you speak to the long-term results? Have you seen anything realized out of the work that you've done with DATAMARK, either, you know, the data remediation cleanup work or like through your use of VEP? Can you speak to that? I mean, we all know how important it is, but I think the proof is in the pudding, right? So do you have anything to say regarding that part of things?
So obviously we use the cross-jurisdictional validation functionality of the VEP engine to look at where we have gaps and overlaps within districts, and have been putting that work in to reduce the amount of gaps and overlaps within our boundaries. But with the validation engine, we have been able to, both with the help of DATAMARK and independent districts work, reach what I feel like is about 25% of all of our districts statewide to, I don't want to say an in-state NG911 I3 compliant standard, but we're pretty close. So, you know, and then through that data set, we will begin to route calls and validate calls as they come into the 911 center, because the data will be ready to go.
That's awesome. That is awesome. All right. Well, while we're waiting for people to put responses in from Annie's last question, I'll put up all of our contact information. That way, if you want to reach out, shoot us an email, ask a question, we're here for you. And I know Nina's had that document out about synchronizing your MSAG, your ALI, your GIS data. That document came out in 2009, you know. And again, it's still very, very valid. We should be doing that. And Nina recommends we should be at that 98% before we can load things into the cloud, into our i3 and our next gen core service systems. But it's a lot of work, right? And then like Annie and Anderson have said, it's an iterative process. You get it in there, you make some corrections, you add new stuff, you validate again, and you continually do it. It's part of your workflow now as you move forward.
Well, and by the way, that 98% only refers to the synchronization of attributes. It doesn't have anything to do with geometry. That's how outdated that information is.
Yep. So,
you know, from a nerd perspective, you know, working with GIS, I mean, you know, there's a lot more that goes into, you know, your geometry. That's why we say it should be beyond that, right? Because the 98%, it doesn't even apply anymore. You really need to shoot for 100.
exactly.
Yeah, the running joke in the office is that my firstborn son's name is going to be Iterative Process Brooms. So
you could call them
IP.
IP for short, right? There you
IP.
go. IP. All right. So while we're waiting to see if there's
ICP.
any more questions or concerns, let me talk about the next session, which is going to be starting in about 10 minutes, which is color theory in the PSAP. There's the speaker's name. So I hope you're able to join the next session as well. I want to thank you guys for being here. I want to thank my panelists, Anderson, Annie, Shannon, Andrew. Thanks for taking time to kind of talk through this with us to help other people understand why it's important to do these boundaries between, hey, your neighboring counties, within your PSAP, and from state to state, so we can get ready for that next gen. So thank you, everybody, for being here. You can hang out for a few minutes if you want, if there's any more questions or anything.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks for hanging out.